This is Voices of Life. Did you know? Episode. A continuing journey through the stories that shaped America's identity and the people whose courage carried this nation forward. In our last episode, we explored how America began to rule the seas. A look at the early naval spirit that rose long before the United States Navy was formally born today. We continue that story because behind that first spark of American sea power stood one man at the center of it all. A commander both celebrated and criticized, a sailor forged by decades on the ocean, a leader chosen to guide a navy that barely existed. His name was Esek Hopkins, the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy, and his legacy is as bold as it is complicated. To guide us through this chapter of America's earliest naval history, your host returns, a voice of clarity, conviction, and faith-anchored perspective, Pastor David.
Thank you for joining us on Voices of Life, a ministry of the Church for Life. I'm Pastor David. America begins to rule the seas, the Esek Hopkins story. America's rise on the seas did not begin with mighty warships, global bases, or seasoned admirals. It began with 8 converted merchant vessels, a handful of Marines, and one controversial commander named Esek Hopkins. He was bold, he was experienced, he was politically connected, and he was chosen to lead a navy that barely existed. He was the only commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. Hopkins was born in Esek, Rhode Island in 1718. He went to sea at 20 and spent decades as a merchant captain. He was an international trader, privateer, and militia commander. By the time Congress needed a navy, Hopkins had sailed to nearly every corner of the world. His experience made him one of the most qualified seamen available, and his family connections made him one of the most politically supported. His younger brother, Stephen Hopkins, was a governor of Rhode Island and a member of the Marine Committee overseeing the naval affairs. Many believed Stephen's influence helped secure Esek's appointment. On December 22, 1775, Congress appointed Hopkins commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. He was placed in command of 8 ships. The ships were the Alfred, Columbus, Andrew Doria, Cabot, Providence, Hornet, Fly, and Wasp. I know some of those names sound very familiar to some of the U.S. Navy warships in World War II. This was America's first naval fleet, a squadron built from merchant vessels and manned by inexperienced crews. Hopkins was tasked with turning this fragile force into a weapon capable of challenging the greatest navy on earth. Congress instructed Hopkins to attack British forces along the southern coast, protect American commerce, and intercept supply ships. But they also gave him broad discretionary authority if circumstances required a change in mission. Hopkins used that discretion boldly and controversially. Instead of sailing south, he turned toward Nassau in the Bahamas, where intelligence suggested the British stored gunpowder and cannon. Washington's army desperately needed both. In March 1776, Hopkins led America's first naval expedition. Continental Marines landed in Nassau, captured forts, seized military supplies, and returned home with valuable cannon and ammunition. This operation became America's first naval expedition. It also was America's first amphibious assault and America's first overseas military operation. Even though much of the gunpowder had been moved before the Americans arrived, the captured equipment proved vital to the revolutionary cause. On the return voyage, Hopkins encountered the British warship HMS Glasgow. Despite being outnumbered, the Glasgow inflicted heavy damage and escaped. Members of Congress were furious. They criticized Hopkins for poor coordination, unnecessary casualties, and failing to capture the enemy ship. This battle became one of the major complaints against his leadership. Congress began investigating Hopkins for disobeying orders, inactivity after the Nassau raid, favoritism, disciplinary issues, and strategic disagreements. He was censured in August 1776, suspended in March 1777, and dismissed on January 2, 1778. America's first naval commander, serving barely 2 years before being removed from office. Modern historians also examine Hopkins' involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. In 1764, he commanded the slave ship Sally, a voyage in which more than half of the enslaved Africans died. This tragedy has become a significant part of his modern legacy, leading to renaming of institutions that once bore his name. This is where, today, many people apply today's values to something that happened several hundred years ago. You cannot even pretend to know what life was back then or what the standards of life for everybody was. And while we believe that slavery is a sin and it never should have happened, it was a fact of life that had been going on for over 1,000 years. But Hopkins is remembered as both a pioneer and paradox. His achievements were first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy, led America's first naval expedition, conducted America's first amphibious assault, and captured critical military supplies. His failures: disobeyed congressional directives, demonstrated leader's shortcoming, and he lost political support, so he failed to be able to develop the Navy into an effective fighting force. Historians often describe him as an excellent sailor and privateer, but an imperfect fleet commander facing impossible circumstances. Have to remember, as he was the first naval commander-in-chief, there was nobody to compare him to except the very experienced British officers that were in the Admiralty and in the British service. Not quite a fair matchup, if you ask me. But before the U.S. Navy, patriots had found an empire, and from their courage, America began to rule the seas. Esek Hopkins is one of the most important and controversial figures in early American naval history, and his contributions definitely led to the United States becoming a nation of power, a nation of will, and a nation of providence. Thank you for listening to this special Did You Know Voices of Life episode. I'm Pastor David. We'll see you next time.
This concludes our companion episode on Esek Hopkins, the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy, a man whose legacy helped shape the earliest identity of American sea power. In our previous episode, we explored how America begins to rule the seas, a story of courage, ambition, and the first sparks of naval tradition. Today, we step deeper into the life of the commander who led that first fleet and the triumphs and controversies that followed him across the waves. Hopkins' story reminds us that the birth of American naval strength was not simple, not perfect, and not without struggle. But it was real, and it was bold, and it helped set the course for a nation learning to stand on its own. Thank you for joining us on this journey through early American history. Your host, Pastor David, will return with more stories that illuminate the courage, the conviction, and the faith that shaped the American spirit. This has been Voices of Life, and as always, we honor the past We learn from its truth, and we carry its lessons forward.